Every legend, no matter how unbelievable, hides a grain of truth somewhere deep within. The story of Black Hollow is no exception. It's a place almost erased from history, a village hidden from time, from memory, as if the very world turned its back on it. Tonight, I invite you to come closer, to listen closely to what I am about to tell you, for it may just change the way you look at those places the world has forgotten. What you're about to hear is the story of Evelyn Hayes, a young woman with a quiet intensity and a devotion to uncovering what others have left buried. Evelyn wasn't an ordinary thrill seeker. She was deliberate in her search for answers, drawn by mysteries that had left others uneasy, almost as though she was chasing something known only to her. Hers is a story pieced together from fragments, her journals, her letters, the small echoes of memory shared by those who knew her best. Evelyn Hayes was pulled into the heart of Black Hollow for reasons we may never fully understand. What led her there, and what eventually led to her disappearance, remains an enigma until now. Imagine a fascination so deep it refuses to let go. Evelyn's interest in Black Hollow was not shallow. It grew out of years of studying obscure histories, puzzling over the tales of abandoned places that seemed to slip from the maps and fade from the minds of the living. It was a lifelong question Evelyn couldn't silence. Why do some towns simply vanish? Black Hollow wasn't easy to find, not by accident, not even by intention. Evelyn first encountered its name whispered in an old book, a place referenced as the Valley of Offerings, an abandoned settlement no one dared to visit. It had all the marks of legend, of a place rumored to have been cursed, a village that had fallen into silence, or worse, a place bound by ancient rituals meant to keep something at bay. Evelyn read these fragments of information carefully, even though they weren't clear. They were more like a hushed tale than a story. But that didn't matter. For Evelyn, each detail was a signpost leading her closer to a truth she could almost feel. Would you have dared to seek out a place shadowed by such a reputation? Evelyn Hayes did. The journey to Black Hollow was not straightforward. Evelyn planned it carefully. She chose the route that led to the outermost reach of civilization, a place few would even think of traveling. Her journey started on well-traveled roads, then veered toward smaller paths, and then trails, growing narrower and emptier until she felt almost alone. The farther she went, the more something within her quickened, though she couldn't yet name it. Eventually, Evelyn reached a place where she could go no farther by car. She parked, leaving behind the last sign of civilization, and began her trek on foot. The path was no ordinary trail. It seemed to coil and twist, almost as if guiding her, but not kindly. As she moved deeper into the forest, the silence grew heavier. It was a silence that wasn't quite empty, but watching. Every sound she made, her footfalls crunching leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, seemed to echo, filling the void around her but never breaking it. Soon, even the birds were absent, leaving only the rustle of leaves above and a sense of being entirely, utterly alone. Imagine following such a path that has not been tread by another human being in years. Would you continue, knowing each step leads you farther from the world you know? At last, Evelyn came upon the first signs of Black Hollow. The forest began to thin, the trees giving way to the faint outlines of what might have once been homes, visible only as silhouettes against the late afternoon light. The sight that met her was surreal. Buildings dark and faded, as if sketched in charcoal, worn down and crumbling in places, yet standing as though they held on to their last purpose, to watch, to wait. She saw a sign tilted at an angle, its words barely legible in the fading paint. "Welcome to Black Hollow," it read. There was no warm greeting here. The words felt strange, as if they had always belonged to another time, another world. Evelyn stood there, staring. She could feel a pull from within, as though she had reached the threshold of a place forgotten by all except itself. For the first time, doubt flickered, but she stepped forward, moving deeper into Black Hollow. The buildings were worn down, as if abandoned in a hurry. Evelyn noted the oddness of the village's layout. It seemed designed almost in a circle, with each house facing inward, toward a central square. She couldn't help but wonder why. Each structure seemed deliberately placed, yet each felt like it was watching her, even inviting her to look closer. The square at the heart of Black Hollow held nothing now but an overgrown patch of weeds, a once important space that seemed to have been neglected for decades. The silence grew thicker as Evelyn crossed into the village. She saw faint symbols carved into wood, faded markings that held no meaning for her, yet felt deliberate. Imagine stepping into a place so untouched by time, so devoid of life, and yet alive with the memory of those who once called it home. Could you go on, knowing something had deliberately erased this place from memory? Evelyn's eyes fell on faint symbols scratched into the wood, crude lines and circles that had been hastily carved, yet with a practiced hand. She sensed that these markings weren't random, they had a purpose. They looked old, even worn, as if they had been meant to protect or preserve something. The symbols continued from house to house, guiding her gaze to the heart of the village. There was an unease here, something she couldn't ignore. She paused, feeling the weight of every empty house pressing down on her. Imagine tracing these symbols with your own fingers, feeling the roughness of wood, wondering what hands had once etched them there, and why. Could you ignore their meaning? As evening fell, Evelyn's surroundings took on an even darker aspect. She felt exposed, even vulnerable, under the dimming light, with shadows lengthening against the cracked, wooden frames of the houses. She found herself instinctively reaching for her flashlight, flicking it on to push back the encroaching dark. She chose one of the smaller buildings near the edge of the village to stay in for the night. The inside was sparse, a single table, chairs coated in dust, an old coat hanging on the wall as though its owner might return any moment. She felt herself shivering, even though the air was still. As night deepened, Evelyn sat alone in the dark, reading over her notes, listening to the quiet that seemed to grow louder with every hour. The shadows stretched further across the floor, shifting as though alive. And somewhere out in the village, she heard it, the faintest sound of movement, almost a whisper, but the night itself gave it away. Imagine sitting there, the silence pressing in, when you hear something that shouldn't be there, a sound that confirms you are not as alone as you believed. She held her breath, her pulse quickening. Was it just the wind, or was it something or someone? She couldn't tell, but she knew one thing: Black Hollow was far from empty. And Evelyn Hayes, for all her courage, was only just beginning to uncover its secrets. Evelyn moved through Black Hollow, her eyes catching the odd remnants of lives left behind, small artifacts that seemed almost purposefully placed. A rusted lantern sat by the road, long abandoned but still holding a faint, burnt smell as though it had once been lit to guide someone back home. A child's doll, dirt-stained and worn, lay just beside it. The fabric was frayed, its stitched eyes almost unseeing, yet somehow focused, staring upward at the now overgrown path. Evelyn's curiosity pulled her closer. These were no mere objects, they were memories, fragments left like pieces of a puzzle. Imagine if you had come across that doll, its surface worn by years of neglect, its eyes faded yet somehow watching you. Would you pick it up, knowing it could hold the final trace of someone who once lived here? Would you feel the weight of that history in your hands? Evelyn did. She held the doll, studying it for clues, as if the very threads and faded fabric could whisper secrets about the last child who played here, someone who might never have had the chance to leave. She could almost picture it, a child running through these quiet streets, the echo of laughter swallowed by time, as if the village had been frozen at the edge of some unseen boundary, just moments before everything changed. The air around her was silent, but far from still. There was a faint sound, not yet clear but lingering, a soft, almost imperceptible murmur, a sound that seemed to follow her just out of reach. She couldn't tell where it came from, yet she felt its presence, weaving through the quiet streets, as if it were a reminder that she was not entirely alone in Black Hollow. Evelyn looked around, her steps slowing. She wondered if this was the village's way of speaking, its own way of reaching out, its voice found within these objects left behind. And she couldn't shake the feeling that something was observing her, waiting. In the heart of Black Hollow stood a small chapel, aged and weary, its wooden door slightly ajar as if inviting her inside. The structure itself was humble, bearing the marks of age and neglect. Yet, as she pushed the door open, it let out a sound, a groan, almost like a reluctant confession. Inside, Evelyn found the walls covered in carvings, symbols and runes etched with deliberate hands. Some marks were deep and jagged, others thin and delicate, but each felt part of a larger message. She traced the patterns with her eyes, and a shiver ran through her, as though she had walked straight into the heart of an ancient secret. A dusty altar stood at the front, bare but for a tattered cloth, its edges lined with symbols that looked familiar yet foreign. It was here that she noticed a small leather-bound book, its pages yellowed, worn, and covered in an uneven script. Evelyn picked it up, her fingers brushing the fragile pages, realizing that it was the journal of the village's last priest. This was her first real clue. The priest's journal contained his own words, a fragmented account of the village's last days. As she began to read, the world around her seemed to disappear, replaced by his words. The priest's entries were scattered, filled with warnings, rituals, and pleas for protection. At first, the writing was calm, even measured, like the record of a man who took his duties seriously. But as the pages went on, the entries grew more chaotic, the letters scrawled and hurried, almost frantic. Evelyn read of the harvest ritual, an ancient rite meant to appease something hidden beneath the earth, something that demanded offerings. It was an annual tradition, yet it was more than just that. Each year, certain villagers were chosen, never to be seen again. The priest described them as offerings, given willingly to maintain the delicate balance. He wrote of the night of the ritual, the night when the village gathered in silence, waiting for dawn with hope that their sacrifice would suffice for another year. The priest's words painted a picture of a village bound to this ritual not by belief, but by survival. The symbols she had seen carved on the houses were not decorations. They were barriers, marks intended to hold back something they dared not name. Evelyn's eyes grew wide as she reached the last entries. The priest's words grew desperate, his pleas almost tangible. He spoke of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, shadows that seemed to move with a mind of their own, and an unspoken fear that the offerings might one day fail to appease whatever lay waiting. The priest's last entry was the shortest, yet it held the greatest weight. He had written simply, "To break the cycle, someone must stay." Imagine reading such a revelation, realizing that every year, this village had held a ritual, a sacrifice, to keep a shadowed presence at bay. And now, knowing that to truly end it, someone would have to remain behind. What would you do with such knowledge? Would you still stay and seek the truth, or would you leave, carrying the weight of their secret but sparing yourself? The journal slipped from Evelyn's hands, her mind racing. She could almost feel the walls of the chapel closing in around her, as though the village itself wanted her to understand, to see what its people had known and feared for so long. It was no simple superstition. This ritual was their lifeline, their means of keeping whatever lay beneath contained. And without it, the consequences she could scarcely imagine. For a moment, Evelyn felt herself wavering. A sense of responsibility filled her, an urge to uncover every remaining part of the truth. She knew that this journey had taken on a purpose she hadn't anticipated. The choice was no longer just about curiosity. It was about survival, hers, and perhaps that of something else. As dusk settled in Black Hollow, Evelyn knew that her search for answers was far from over. The chapel's presence loomed over her, each carving and symbol now laden with meaning, each corner casting shadows that felt like lingering spirits, watching her with silent eyes. The faint whisper returned, a sound that followed her from the chapel, threading through the village streets, soft but growing louder, as though beckoning her further, asking her to look deeper. She felt the pull as strongly as she felt her own heartbeat. Somewhere in the village lay the answers she sought, yet they would not reveal themselves so easily. And so, as the final light of day vanished from the village, Evelyn prepared herself to face Black Hollow's secrets. She was determined, drawn forward by a need to know what had brought this village to the edge of memory, what had erased it from the maps. She would uncover the truth, no matter what the cost. Evelyn had come too far to turn back now, even as the night deepened around her, casting shadows across Black Hollow's lifeless streets. Yet something pulled her back toward the chapel, toward its ancient, worn interior. She moved forward, her resolve only strengthened by the weight of the priest's words, the dire message scrawled in his journal. It was no longer just curiosity that fueled her. She felt an urgent need to uncover the truth, as if the village itself demanded her presence. With each step she took into the chapel's hidden passages, Evelyn understood that she was stepping into the heart of a story forgotten by the rest of the world. The stones beneath her feet were worn smooth, as though countless villagers had descended this way before, carrying with them the same trepidation that Evelyn now felt creeping up her spine. Evelyn discovered a narrow, winding staircase descending into the chapel's depths. It spiraled down into darkness, its walls lined with faded carvings she couldn't decipher. But their purpose was clear. They were warnings, remnants of a people who had understood the gravity of the ritual that bound them. As she descended, her breaths grew shallow. The air was colder, stale, as though it hadn't been touched by life in centuries. As Evelyn moved deeper, the weight on her chest grew heavier. Her flashlight, weak and flickering, barely cut through the thick shadows. The silence became almost unbearable, pressing down on her, until she began to hear it, the whispering, growing louder with every step. It was no longer faint, but a low murmur, voices layering over each other, blending into an unsettling harmony that seemed to echo within her mind. Imagine standing where Evelyn stood, surrounded by walls etched with unknown symbols, feeling the cold seep into your bones as whispers seem to rise from the stones themselves. Would you continue? Would you risk everything for answers, or would you turn back? Evelyn's steps slowed as she entered a vast, underground chamber. In the dim light, she could just make out the shape of an altar at the center, hewn from stone and darkened by age. It was layered with dust and remnants of ritual objects, rusted metal, brittle fragments of old cloth, dried herbs scattered across its surface. Her fingers grazed these objects, and she felt a chill, a sense that they carried memories too ancient to comprehend, pieces of countless ceremonies that had kept something alive, something that demanded recognition. It was there, at that altar, that Evelyn began to truly understand the magnitude of Black Hollow's secret. This was not merely a place of worship. It was the village's tether, the binding between their world and something else. The villagers had known that, understood it intimately. And now, Evelyn was beginning to feel the full weight of that knowledge. The air around her was thick with an undefinable energy, charged and oppressive, pushing against her lungs with each breath. She felt the faint pull of the altar, as though it were a lodestone drawing her closer. And yet, every part of her told her to turn back, to leave this place before its secrets consumed her. Evelyn took a step back, her resolve wavering. The instinct to leave was powerful, almost overwhelming. But when she turned to retrace her steps, something became horribly clear. The path she'd taken to enter the chamber was gone. Evelyn's heart pounded, and she spun in place, trying to find any indication of the staircase, the narrow passage she descended. But there was nothing. The walls closed in on her, solid and unyielding. Panic swelled within her chest. She was trapped, left only with the altar and the artifacts scattered around it, relics that now felt like the last traces of an ancient contract. Imagine if you were Evelyn, standing in that chamber, knowing the way out had vanished. Could you keep calm? Could you find clarity? Or would the weight of that enclosed darkness close in on you? Her breathing quickened, and just then, the murmur of voices began again, louder, filling the chamber. And then she heard it, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing from a shadowed corner of the room. The footsteps grew nearer, their pace unhurried yet certain, as if they had found their way through this darkness countless times before. And then, Evelyn saw him, a figure half-shadowed, cloaked in robes that seemed as ancient as the altar itself. The figure was spectral, his face pale and translucent, eyes sunken, yet holding a sharp, penetrating gaze. He appeared like an apparition from another time, a ghostly priest forever bound to the chapel's catacombs. Evelyn took a step back, her instincts urging her to retreat, but his eyes held her in place, as though he were assessing her, reading her very thoughts. "You came here for answers, Evelyn," the figure spoke, his voice a rasp that seemed to echo from within the walls themselves. But answers come at a cost. Her flashlight flickered, its beam reflecting off his figure, giving her glimpses of his robes, tattered and stained, marked with symbols she recognized from the chapel walls. They were binding symbols, marks intended to contain, to protect. But what had they contained? And what had they been trying to protect themselves from? Evelyn tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The figure's presence was overwhelming, like a force that held her firmly in place. He pointed toward the altar, and she could see, in the dim light, the faint outline of symbols inscribed upon its surface. The priest's voice grew softer, almost sorrowful, as he began to explain. Black Hollow, he said, was not a place of peace, nor merely a forgotten village. It was a place of binding, a place where the villagers had formed an unbreakable contract, one that had kept the village alive but chained to an unspeakable duty. The priest told her of the Hollow, a being that had once ravaged the land before the villagers bound it beneath the earth. Every year, it demanded tribute, a life to hold it in place, to keep its hunger at bay. The villagers had become both its protectors and its prisoners, forever bound to the ritual that kept it contained. Evelyn listened, horror dawning upon her as she understood. The priest, too, had been bound to this fate, a guardian cursed to linger, overseeing the ritual even in death. He moved closer, his eyes locking onto hers, his gaze intense. "You sought the truth, Evelyn," he whispered, his voice a dry whisper. "But you must give, as we have all given." At that moment, Evelyn's purpose became clear. She was not just a visitor, she was a part of this now, bound by her very presence in Black Hollow. The priest's gaze held her, unwavering, and she realized that the cost of understanding was far more than she'd ever anticipated. A surge of panic washed over Evelyn, and in a sudden burst of movement, she bolted. Her flashlight swung wildly, casting fleeting shadows as she ran. The whispering intensified, and the walls seemed to shift around her, narrowing, closing in, as though guiding her back to the altar. She could hear the priest's voice, echoing in the darkness, calling her name, urging her back. Each step Evelyn took was frantic, desperate. She sprinted through the catacombs, every turn seeming to bring her back to the same place, to that altar, to the priest's relentless gaze. And with each step, her fear grew, gnawing at her. She felt the pull of the village's curse, tightening around her like a net. Her breaths came fast, her heart racing. Shadows leapt and danced around her, closing in, and her flashlight's dim glow flickered as she stumbled, her strength draining. No matter where she turned, the path led her back to the altar, to the very place she had tried to escape. At last, Evelyn stood once more before the altar, her mind reeling, trapped in a cycle she could not escape. The priest's form reappeared, his voice quiet but resolute. He extended a hand, gesturing toward a book that lay on the altar. A book filled with words she could not fully understand, yet felt compelled to read. Evelyn knew, in that moment, that the choice was no longer hers alone. Black Hollow demanded its offering, as it had every year, and she had become a part of that cycle. She had ventured too deeply, and now, the village would not release her. The priest spoke, his voice an ancient incantation, words that resonated with the very stones around her. Evelyn's hands shook as she picked up the book, her eyes scanning the symbols, the final passage of the ritual that would complete the cycle once more. With trembling hands, Evelyn began to speak the words, her voice barely above. A whisper, each syllable resonating in the hollow chamber. The darkness seemed to gather around her, a dense, consuming void. And as her voice faded, a silence fell over the village, a silence that felt like a sigh, like the village's breath held in waiting. The chapel fell silent, its walls bearing the weight of countless lives, of a cycle that would continue. The last we hear of Evelyn is the faint echo of her voice, a final whisper swallowed by the